Charlotte's life was supposed to be a straight line. A line drawn by her father, the judge, all the way from the manicured lawns of the East to the dusty promise of California. She was cargo in a closed carriage, surrounded by trunks that smelled of rosewater and a future she didn't choose, promised to a man whose face she could barely recall. The world outside the carriage window was just a blur of green and brown, a long, slow dream she was meant to wake from as someone else's wife. Then the dream became a nightmare. It happened at the river. The water was shallow, the crossing supposed to be simple. But the forest wasn't simple. From the ridge above, shadows detached themselves from the trees. Wolves, a whole pack, moving with a terrifying silence that was worse than any growl. They didn't howl. They just came. The first one hit the water like a thrown stone. The horses screamed, a sound of pure terror that ripped through the quiet afternoon. Their eyes rolled white, and one snapped its harness, a gunshot crack of leather and wood. The carriage wheel, already struggling in the mud, gave way. The world tilted, a sickening lurch, and then it shattered. Charlotte was thrown. She felt a brutal, sharp impact against her hip, a starburst of pain that stole her breath. Then the cold shock of the river. The current was a monster, grabbing at her, pulling her down. Her heavy skirt felt like an anchor made of lead. She saw flashes of chaos, splintered wood, the driver's lifeless body, a horse tumbling end over end, all of it swallowed by the churning water and tangled branches. She was going under. Her fingers, numb and clumsy, found a floating log. She clung to it, her knuckles white, the water slapping her face again and again. She screamed, but the river just roared back. The pain in her hip was a hot, throbbing thing, but the will to live was hotter. With a final desperate surge, her hand found a rock at the river bank. She clawed her way out, dragging herself through mud and slick moss, coughing up water, shivering so hard her teeth chattered. She was alive. Her fine dress was in tatters, her hair a muddy plaster against her skin. She staggered to her feet, leaning against a tree, gasping for air. And that's when she heard it. A low growl from the trees behind her. Then another. They hadn't given up. The wolves were still on her trail. She started walking, then stumbling, then running. Every step was fire. The forest became an enemy, its branches like claws, its roots like snares. Her breath was a ragged tear in her throat. She pushed on, driven by pure animal fear. Finally, she collapsed into a small clearing, her lungs burning, convinced she'd lost them. But the forest was never truly quiet. A twig snapped behind her. Leaves rustled where there was no wind. She froze. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat in her ears. It was the wolves again. She knew it. They were closing in. 3 dark shapes slunk out from the undergrowth, their eyes glowing like embers in the twilight. They moved with a chilling confidence, fanning out, trapping her. Charlotte scrambled backward, her strength gone. She fell to her knees, waiting for the end. The lead wolf crouched, muscles bunched, ready to leap. Then came a whistle, sharp and clear. An arrow slammed into the ground, just inches from the wolf's paw, quivering. Another whistle. Another arrow. The wolves stopped dead. They sniffed the air, a new kind of fear in their posture, and then they were gone, melting back into the shadows they'd come from. Charlotte was left trembling, unable to process what had just happened. And then she saw him. He emerged from the trees, not with a rush, but with a slow, deliberate walk. He was tall, built like the pines around him, a bow held loosely in one hand. His face was all harsh angles, his eyes dark and unreadable. He moved like he was part of the forest, like he'd grown from the very same soil. Charlotte dragged herself backward, terror flaring anew. "No, don't hurt me," she whispered, the words barely audible. The man knelt beside her. His voice was low, laced with an accent she'd never heard. "You are hurt." She tried to speak, to ask who he was, what he wanted, but the words wouldn't come. Her limbs were numb, her mind a fog of shock and pain. He didn't wait for an answer. He wrapped her in a coarse, heavy blanket, lifted her into his arms as if she weighed nothing, and started walking. He didn't say another word. The cabin was a secret the forest kept well, tucked high on a hill, almost invisible among the dense trees. It wasn't grand or beautiful, just solid, dry, safe. He laid her down on a pile of blankets near a small, crackling fire, offering her water in a carved wooden bowl before placing a cool, damp cloth on her forehead. She was drifting in and out of consciousness, the world a blur of firelight and shadow, but in a moment of clarity, she thought she heard someone murmur a name. Atta. Or maybe she dreamed it. He sat nearby, a silent, watchful guardian, as the fire danced and the rain began to fall outside, washing away every track, every trace of the nightmare that had brought her here. Charlotte closed her eyes, suspended in a strange space between life and death. She didn't know if this stranger was her savior, or if he was just a different kind of wolf. Golden light seeped through the cracks in the log roof, painting the cabin in soft, hesitant stripes. Morning had come. Charlotte opened her eyes, every muscle protesting. Her hip was a dull, constant ache, a grim reminder of the chaos, but the fear that had been lodged in her chest like a shard of ice had thawed, just a little. She was still alive. She looked around. The floor was packed earth, the walls were solid logs. Beside her was the empty bowl, and across the small room by the glowing embers of the fire sat the man. He was crouched, stirring the coals with a stick. He hadn't left her. As she tried to sit up, a sharp gasp of pain escaped her lips. His head turned, not quickly, but with a fluid certainty. "Pain," he said. It wasn't a question. He pointed to her hip. She studied him, the conflict warring inside her. Fear versus a desperate, burgeoning trust. His accent was thick, each word sounding like it was carved from stone, but she understood. "Where am I?" she whispered, her voice raspy. "Mountain. Refuge," he answered, rising to his feet. He moved with a grace she'd never seen in the stiff, formal men of her world. He moved like a predator, silent and sure. He brought her a steaming bowl, the smell earthy and strange, a broth of roots and herbs. "What is this?" He just glanced at her. "Not poison." A startled, nervous laugh bubbled out of her. "Thank you, I suppose." He nodded, his expression unchanging. "Rest today, tomorrow walk." She sipped the broth. Warmth spread through her, chasing away some of the deep-seated chill. He watched her from a distance, a man clearly comfortable with silence. "Atta," she murmured, testing the name she thought she'd heard. "Is that your name?" He gave a single, curt nod. "Means hawk." His English was broken, but clear. "You know my language." He tilted his head. "Soldiers taught." The word hung in the air, heavy with unspoken history. "You were with them?" she pressed, her curiosity overriding her caution. Instead of answering, he stood and moved to a corner where strips of dried meat hung from the rafters. The message was clear. Some doors were not to be opened. The day passed in a slow, quiet rhythm. He tended to her hip, binding it with a poultice of crushed leaves and clean cloth. He gave her water and a piece of coarse, dense bread. She ate, watching him. He wasn't old, but his face was weathered by sun and wind, etched with lines that spoke of a life lived far from parlors and courtrooms. His eyes held something ancient, something that existed before cities and laws. By the afternoon, he left the cabin. A spike of fear shot through her. But the door wasn't barred. He had simply placed another blanket over her. "Back soon. Rest," he'd said, and his gaze had been direct, steady. He returned at dusk with firewood and a string of fish. They prepared the meal with gestures and glances, a clumsy dance of two different worlds. That night, he slept near the doorway, a silent sentinel wrapped in his own blanket. He made no move toward her, asked no prying questions. He just kept watch. As she drifted off to the sound of the crackling fire and his steady breathing, a strange thought surfaced in her mind. He hadn't just saved her from the wolves. He had brought her to a place where the world she knew couldn't find her, and she wasn't sure if that was a rescue or a capture. In his cabin, time lost its shape. There were no clocks, no bells to mark the hours. There was only the rising and setting of the sun, the shifting shadows of the pines, the slow burn of the fire. Charlotte stopped counting the days. 3, 5, a week? It didn't matter. She was healing. The fire in her hip had cooled to a persistent ache. She could walk now, leaning on a sturdy staff Ada had carved for her. He was a man of few words, but his silence was a language of its own. It wasn't empty or hostile. It was a space he gave her, a quiet he never invaded. She found herself craving it. Each morning, he would leave her food and then melt into the forest, returning at dusk with game or fish. In his absence, she began to claim the small space as her own. She washed their bowls, folded the blankets, kept the fire fed. She was learning the rhythm of this new life, the boundaries of this strange, silent man. One afternoon, she found him sharpening a knife on a smooth river stone. The sound was hypnotic, rhythmic. She sat across from him, leaving a careful distance between them. "What is that called?" she asked, pointing to a bundle of dried herbs hanging from the rafters. He glanced up, his hands never ceasing their motion. "Tilago." "What is it for?" "For cough." She repeated the word, "Tilago," memorizing it. She pointed to another. "White sage." A moment passed. "Do you have another name? Besides Ada?" He paused, his dark eyes fixing on hers. "Ada is the name." "It only means hawk," she pressed gently. He seemed to be weighing his words. "When I was a boy," he said finally, his voice low, "I fell into a deep crack in the earth. No one could find me. A hawk circled the spot all day until my father saw it. He said the hawk was my guardian." The story was so simple, so pure, it left her speechless. It came from a world she couldn't imagine. "I've never seen one up close," she whispered. "Here, Manny," he gestured vaguely toward the sky. "But you must know how to look." He broke a piece of dried meat and handed it to her. "Eat." She took it, a small smile touching her lips. "Thank you." He lowered his eyes, but she saw the corner of his mouth twitch. "You're welcome." Later, as she was helping him sort through some roots, her fingers brushed against a small leather-bound book tucked away in his pack. It was out of place in this rustic cabin, its embossed cover worn smooth with handling. Her curiosity got the better of her. She pulled it out. It was a book of poetry, English poetry. And tucked inside the front cover was a pressed flower, a rose, the kind that grew in manicured eastern gardens. Not here. Her blood ran cold. "Where did you get this?" she asked, her voice tight. He turned, his face unreadable. He looked at the book, then at her. He didn't answer. He just took the book from her hands, his touch surprisingly gentle, and placed it back in his pack, hiding it from view. But it was too late. The quiet refuge of the cabin suddenly felt different. It felt like a place with secrets. The man who moved like a hawk, who spoke of spirit animals and mountain remedies, had a piece of her world hidden in his bag. The question wasn't just where he got it. The question was who he got it from, and what happened to them. The discovery of the book changed the air in the cabin. It was no longer a simple refuge. It was a place holding a question she was too afraid to ask. Every time she saw his pack, she thought of the pressed rose. Who was she? The woman who loved poetry and gardens. Was she here, in this wilderness, before Charlotte? What had become of her? Ada offered no explanation, and his silence, which had once felt like a comfort, now felt like a wall. He seemed to know something had shifted between them. He watched her more closely, his dark eyes trying to read the new tension in her face. One night, a thin, persistent rain began to fall. It wasn't a storm, just a steady weeping from the sky that seemed to seep into the very logs of the cabin. Charlotte had been out gathering firewood and returned soaked, her cloak heavy and dripping. As she hung it by the fire, a shiver racked her body that had nothing to do with the cold. The next morning, Ada found her tangled in her blankets, her skin hot to the touch, her face pale and beaded with sweat. "Heat," he murmured, his voice laced with a grim certainty. "Fever." Without a word, he disappeared into the rain-soaked forest. He moved with a new urgency, a shadow slipping between the dripping trees. He knew what to find: oak leaves, willow bark, a bitter root that grew only in the deepest, oldest parts of the woods. When he returned, his hands were full, his expression set like stone. He brewed a dark, potent tea, forcing her to drink it. He bathed her forehead with cool cloths. He sat by her side for hours, a silent, unwavering presence as the fever raged. She drifted in a hallucinatory haze. She murmured names, her mother's, her father's, and his, Ada. She spoke of the river, of the wolves, of a book with a dead flower inside. He listened to her fragmented ramblings, his face a stoic mask. But when she whispered, "Did you hurt her too?" his hand stilled for a brief, almost imperceptible moment. The fever broke on the third day. She woke, weak and drained, to find him grinding herbs in a stone bowl. "How long?" she rasped. "3 sons," he replied without looking up. He helped her sit, his touch firm and steady. "Rest more." She didn't argue. In her weakness, a new kind of trust had taken root. He had not abandoned her. He had fought the sickness alongside her. "You took care of me," she said, her voice filled with a quiet awe. He finally looked at her. "You said my name in your fever." His eyes held hers. "You also spoke of another." A woman from the book. Her heart stuttered. Who was she? Ada set down the bowl. He walked to his pack, pulled out the leather-bound book, and this time he opened it for her. On the inside cover, in elegant looping script, was an inscription: "To my dearest Jonathan, may these words be a bridge between our worlds. All my love, Eleanor." And below it, a date from 2 years prior. Her name was Eleanor, Ada said, his voice flat. And Jonathan was not me. The name Jonathan hit her like a physical blow. Eleanor. Jonathan. 2 people from her world, here in this remote wilderness. "What happened to them?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Ada stared into the fire, his face a landscape of shadows. "They came here, like you, lost. He was a scholar, a dreamer. She was, like the flower, bright, but not meant for this soil." His words painted a picture of a couple hopelessly out of place, trying to carve a life from a land that did not want them. "He wanted to study my people, to write down our stories. She just wanted him." Ada paused, his jaw tight. "They were not careful. They made noise. They built fires that could be seen for miles." He turned to her, his eyes burning with a cold fire she hadn't seen before. "There are others in these mountains. Not my people. White men. Men who look for gold, who take what is not theirs. They found them." He didn't need to say what happened next. The air grew thick with the unspoken violence. "I found the camp after. It was like your caravan. Destroyed." He looked at the book in his hands. This was all that was left. So he wasn't a thief. He was a keeper of relics, a witness to a tragedy. The relief was so profound it almost made her dizzy. But it was followed by a new, chilling realization. The men who had found Jonathan and Eleanor were still out there. and he had just told her that he and Charlotte were not alone. That afternoon, he went out to hunt. When he returned, he was carrying something wrapped in a piece of soft deer hide. He wordlessly placed it beside her. She unwrapped it. It was a pendant, carved from a piece of bone in the perfect, intricate shape of a hawk in flight. She didn't have to ask if it was for her. She clutched it in her hand, the smooth bone a comfort against her skin. Later, as they sat by the fire, she found the courage to ask another question. "What about your shoulder?" He went still. She was talking about the scar she'd glimpsed once when his shirt had shifted, a brutal, jagged line that ran from his collarbone down his chest. Slowly, deliberately, he unfastened the top of his shirt, letting the fabric fall away to reveal the puckered, discolored flesh. It was an ugly thing, a mark of pure hatred. "White soldiers," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "Captive. 3 moons. Why? Because my skin is the wrong color. Because I would not tell them where my people were." He had been just a boy, 17. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of a genocide. Charlotte felt a hot surge of rage, not pity. Her entire world, with its laws and its judges and its fine carriages, was built on the foundation of this kind of brutality. "You didn't deserve that," she said, her voice shaking. He finally met her gaze. "I know. That is why I did not die." That night, she didn't retreat to her corner. She moved her blankets closer to the fire, sitting near him. They didn't speak. They listened to the forest and the fire, and in the shared silence, a fragile trust was being rebuilt, stronger than before. It was no longer a trust born of necessity, but of understanding. They were 2 survivors, marked by the same cruel world, finding refuge in each other. The forest was different. It wasn't the birds or the wind. It was a stillness, a held breath. Ada sensed it the moment he stepped outside at dawn. There was a wrongness in the air, a scent that didn't belong. He left earlier than usual, moving through the woods like smoke, his steps making no sound. Charlotte was still asleep, the hawk pendant clutched in her hand. He didn't expect to find game. He was tracking the wrongness. He found it a mile south. Smoke. Not the clean smoke of a well-tended campfire, but the greasy, acrid smoke of ruin. When he reached the clearing, his blood ran cold. It was her caravan, or what was left of it. Wagons splintered, wheels half buried in mud, crates smashed open. Books, their pages swollen and warped by the rain, lay scattered like dead leaves. Expensive fabrics were shredded and trampled into the dirt. The horses were dead, their bodies already beginning to bloat. It was a scene of total devastation. He circled the clearing, his eyes missing nothing. The story was clear. An attack. Brutal and swift. But something was wrong. There were no bodies, no signs of the other people from the caravan. They had either been taken, or they had fled. But there was something else. A boot print, deep in the mud near one of the broken wagons. It wasn't the print of a soldier's boot, and it wasn't made by one of his people. It was a heavy, cleated print, a prospector, a gold hunter. Then he saw it. Dangling from the branch of a low-hanging pine, caught as if by accident, was a lady's handkerchief. It was fine linen, embroidered with a delicate golden thread, her initials. He knew it was hers. He carefully untangled it, folded it, and tucked it away. He returned to the cabin to find Charlotte by the fire, mending a tear in her clothes. She looked up as he entered, her eyes questioning his long absence and the grim set of his jaw. He sat across from her, laid the embroidered handkerchief on the blanket between them. Her breath hitched. She picked it up, her fingers tracing the familiar stitching. "It's mine." He nodded. "Wagons. South." He paused. "No one there." Her face went pale. "What? What happened?" "Bad," was all he said. She didn't cry. The girl who had wept in a fever dream was gone. In her place was a woman who stared into the heart of a tragedy and did not flinch. Her mind raced, filling in the brutal gaps. No survivors, no rescue party. No one was looking for her. Her father, her fiancé, her whole world believed she was dead, buried in the wreckage of her own life. She stood and walked outside, needing the cold air. Atta didn't follow. He gave her the space she needed. She stood at the edge of the clearing, staring at the mountains that had become both her prison and her sanctuary. Who was she, if she didn't exist in anyone's memory? For the first time, she felt utterly, terrifyingly free. The sun began to dip below the ridge when she finally walked back into the cabin. She sat beside him, the silence stretching between them. "Give me a knife," she said, her voice low but steady. He frowned. "Why?" "I want to learn." "Learn what?" "How to live here," she said, meeting his gaze. "How not to die if you find yourself alone." He held her gaze for a long moment. Then he stood, went to a small wooden chest, and returned with a knife. The handle was dark, worn smooth, the blade narrow and sharp. "It is not for fighting," he said, his voice grave. "It is for cutting, for building, for respecting what you take." She took it from him. The cool weight of the steel in her hand felt like a promise, a pact. That night they sat back to back by the fire, sharing its warmth. No words were spoken, but a silent understanding had been forged. Charlotte was no longer waiting to be rescued. The world had left her for dead, and in doing so, it had given her a chance to truly live, and she was going to learn how. The knife changed everything. Mornings were no longer just for quiet chores. They became lessons in survival. Charlotte followed Atta into the forest, her carved staff in one hand, the knife tucked into a makeshift belt. At first, he ignored her, moving through the trees with his usual silent grace. But he didn't send her back. He let her follow, and slowly he began to teach. "This," he said one morning, stopping her with a hand on her arm, pointing to a small, blue-petaled flower. "Do not step on it. It is medicine. If the stem is broken, the spirit leaves." Charlotte crouched, studying it. "What is it called?" "In your tongue, I do not know. In mine, Ashza, woman's flower." "Why?" "It heals pains that men do not have." She committed the name and the knowledge to memory. She learned to read the story the world wrote every day, the story told in deer tracks and bent twigs, in the call of a crow, in the smell of rain on the wind. She learned that silence wasn't emptiness. It was a way of listening. Fear, she discovered, wasn't an enemy to be conquered. It was a companion to walk beside, a reminder to be careful. One afternoon he taught her how to set a snare. Her fingers were clumsy with the rope, her knots loose. He watched her struggle for a moment, then knelt beside her. He didn't take the rope from her. Instead, he guided her hands with his touch rough but patient. "Like this," he murmured, his breath warm against her ear. "The rope must think for itself." A strange heat flooded her cheeks. It was the closest they had been. It was the first time his touch had felt like something other than a doctor's or a guardian's. That night, she asked him about his life before the soldiers. "My grandfather taught me," he said, staring into the fire. "He taught me the songs of the trees, the language of the river." "And your grandfather?" "They killed him." The words were dropped like stones into a still pond. "Soldiers?" "Worse," he said, a muscle twitching in his jaw. "Fear killed him. They had guns. He had songs." Over time, a new language grew between them, a mix of his tongue and hers, of gestures and shared glances. It was a language that belonged only to them, spoken only in this small cabin on the side of a mountain. "How do you say earth?" she asked one day. "Shah." "And sky?" "Ya." "Shah-ya," she tried. He gave her the faintest hint of a smile. "Not so easy. It is here, too." He touched his chest, over his heart. "Without this," he said, his dark eyes intense, "you understand nothing." She held his gaze and she understood. He wasn't just teaching her words, he was teaching her how to see. But the question of the single boot print he'd found at the caravan site still haunted him. One man. Where had he gone? Why had he been there? One evening, as Charlotte slept, Ada took a burning branch from the fire and walked back to the site of the wreckage. The stench of death was fading, but the ruin remained. He searched again, this time more slowly, more carefully. Tucked under the corner of an overturned trunk, half buried in the mud, he found it. A leather pouch. Heavy. He opened it. It wasn't filled with coins. It was filled with raw, uncut gold. Nuggets. The kind men killed for. This wasn't a random attack. It was a robbery. But it still didn't explain why they had taken no prisoners and left such a prize behind. Unless the pouch had been lost in the chaos. Or unless the man with the heavy boots wasn't one of the attackers. Maybe he was one of the victims. And maybe he was still out there. Autumn began to paint the high leaves gold. The air grew crisp, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. Charlotte no longer felt like a visitor in this world. She felt like a part of it. The softness had been burned out of her, replaced by a quiet strength she never knew she possessed. Her hands were no longer the pale, delicate hands of a judge's daughter. They were capable, calloused, sure. Ada was no longer a stranger. He was the other half of her silence, the steady presence that anchored her to this new life. One afternoon, she saw him washing by the stream, his shirt off. The full map of his past was there on his skin. Not just the brutal scar on his chest, but a dozen others, souvenirs of a life of conflict and survival. He saw her watching and didn't try to cover himself. He simply met her gaze. "Who did this to you?" She'd asked him before about the soldier's mark. Now she just looked, understanding that every scar was a word in a story he would never fully tell. He came and sat on the bank beside her. "After the soldiers," he said, his voice quiet. "I did not return to my people. They said the anger had changed me, that I carried a bad spirit. Do you believe that?" "No," he said, "but sometimes I feel it." She reached out, her fingers tracing the jagged line on his chest. It wasn't a gesture of pity, it was a gesture of recognition. "That does not define you." His eyes flickered to her face. "And you?" he asked. "What left its mark on you?" She didn't have to think. "My old life. A world that told me how to dress, how to speak, how to marry a man I didn't love for a future I didn't want." She looked at her own hands. Now I breathe for myself." That night, the sky was a black velvet blanket, punched through with a million glittering stars. After they ate, he led her up a narrow trail to a wide, flat rock that overlooked the entire valley. The world fell away below them, silent and asleep. They sat shoulder to shoulder, the warmth of his body a solid presence beside her. "I've never seen so many," she whispered. "They are always there," he said. "People forget to look up." He pointed out the constellations, giving them names from his own language. Yikista, the bearer of the night. Kono, the silent hunter. She found herself humming, a half-remembered lullaby her mother used to sing. The simple, sad melody floated on the cold night air. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "Your voice," he said, "is like calm water." She laughed, a soft, surprised sound. Was that a compliment? He nodded. "My people sing from the chest. You sing from the soul." "How do you say soul?" she asked. "Noost." She tried to repeat it, and he corrected her gently. They spent an hour under the stars, trading words, naming the world, their shoulders occasionally brushing. On the way back down the trail, her hand brushed his. He caught it, his large, rough fingers intertwining with hers. He didn't let go. Back at the cabin, while she slept, he stayed awake by the fire, listening to her steady breathing. He pulled out the pouch of gold nuggets he had found. He had kept it hidden, unsure of its meaning. Now a dark premonition settled over him. This gold was a seed of violence, and he had a terrible feeling that the man who had lost it would eventually come back to find it, and find them. The wind began to carry a new message. It wasn't just the chill of winter coming. It was something else, something human. Ada felt it first, a tension in the woods, a disruption of the natural rhythm. "We are not alone," he said one morning, his hand resting on the hilt of his knife. Charlotte felt a familiar spike of fear, but it was cold and sharp now, not frantic. "Who?" "They passed in the valley yesterday," he said, his eyes scanning the tree line. "3 of them, not soldiers, prospectors. They smell of whiskey and greed. The men from her nightmares, the ones who had found Eleanor and Jonathan. They spent the day in a tense silence. Ada hid their few supplies, camouflaged the entrance to the cabin, and built a smokeless fire in a deep pit. "If something happens to me," he told her, his voice low and urgent, "run to the river, follow it downstream. Do not stop, do not look back." "I won't leave you," she said, her voice fierce. "You will if you must." Yes, they came at dusk, 3 shapes moving clumsily through the trees. They were rough men with pistols tucked into their belts and a hunger in their eyes. Charlotte watched from a hiding place Ada had shown her, her heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm against her ribs. "Anyone here?" one of them shouted, his voice jarring in the quiet woods. "We saw smoke a few days back, just looking for a place to rest our heads." Ada stepped out from behind a large boulder, his bow in his hand. An arrow knocked. He was the very picture of deadly calm. "There is nothing for you here," he said, his voice even. One of the men laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Well now, look what we got here. An Indian. That's for us to decide, ain't it?" The man took a step forward. Ada drew his bow. The string hummed. The arrow buried itself in the dirt a hair's breadth from the man's boot. The message was unmistakable. The men froze. They exchanged nervous glances, weighing their odds. They weren't soldiers. They were opportunistic thugs. An arrow in the chest wasn't worth whatever they thought they might find in a tiny hidden cabin. Muttering curses, they backed away and disappeared into the twilight. Charlotte emerged from her hiding place, her body trembling with adrenaline. "They're gone." Ada nodded, his eyes still fixed on the trees. "For now, they will come back." She looked at him, standing there, a lone guardian against a world of predators. "I thought you were going to kill them." "No," he said, finally lowering the bow. "Killing is easy. It is better to remind them." "Remind them of what?" He turned to look at her, his dark eyes seeming to see right through her. "That some things are not theirs to take." That night they didn't sleep in their separate spaces. The threat had erased the distance between them. She lay down near him, and when a shiver ran through her, he wrapped an arm around her, pulling her close. His body was a warm, solid wall against the fear and the cold. For the first time, he wasn't just protecting the mountain, he was protecting her. And in his arms, Charlotte finally understood. This was home. The prospectors were gone, but their presence lingered like a bad smell. Atta was warier, his senses on a knife's edge. He knew men like that. Their greed was a sickness, and they wouldn't be scared off by a single arrow for long. They would be back, and with more men. The fragile peace of their world had been shattered. In the days that followed, a new intensity grew between them. They worked side by side, reinforcing the cabin, stockpiling firewood, preparing for a siege that felt both inevitable and insane. The unspoken emotions that had simmered beneath the surface for months finally began to boil over. One afternoon, as she was helping him stretch a deer hide, Their hands touched. It was a simple, accidental contact, but it felt like a spark in a tinderbox. He froze. She froze. The air crackled. "Charlotte," he said, his voice thick. It was the first time he had used her name with such raw emotion. "Have you ever been in love?" she asked, her voice shaking slightly, surprising them both. He looked up from his work, his dark eyes searching hers. "Why do you ask that?" "Because I don't know if I am," she confessed. "And I don't know what it feels like." He was silent for a long time, his hands still on the hide. "It feels," he said at last, his voice barely a whisper, "like your chest hurts, not because something is gone, but because you are no longer alone inside it." She nodded slowly, her own chest aching with a sweet, unfamiliar pain. "Then I think I am." The world seemed to stop. He stared at her, his face a mask of shock and something else, something vulnerable. "I am too," he breathed. That night, the fire burned low, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. They sat facing each other, the space between them charged with everything that had just been said. "What does it mean to you?" she asked. "To be in love?" He looked at the fire. "It means I don't run when I am afraid. It means I don't leave when you are hurt." He looked at her. "Do I scare you?" "Yes," he admitted, and the honesty of it stole her breath. "Atta," she whispered, "I don't know how to do this." "Neither do I." She moved closer, their knees touching. Their hands found each other in the space between them, his large and rough, hers smaller but strong. He laced his fingers through hers. No kiss, no embrace, just this connection, more powerful than either. "Tell me something you have never said," she murmured. He held her gaze, and his lips moved, shaping the words with a reverence she had never heard. "You changed me." She didn't answer. She leaned forward and pressed her forehead against his. In that touch, in the shared breath between them, their two broken worlds became one. And it was perfect. But their perfect world was about to be invaded again. 2 days later, Atta found new tracks by the stream. The prospectors, they were back, and this time, there were more of them. 6 men. He returned to the cabin, his face grim. "They are hunting," he said. "Not for gold. For us." Charlotte's blood ran cold. "Why?" He pulled out the leather pouch of gold nuggets he'd kept hidden. "I believe this belonged to one of them. They think we stole it." He had tried to hide the evidence of the other world, but it had found them anyway. "We have to leave," she said, her voice urgent. "There is nowhere to go," he said. "This mountain is all I have. It is all we have. We do not run." The stand they were about to make wasn't just for a cabin. It was for their life. It was for their love. And they both knew that this time, not everyone would walk away. The air grew heavy with the coming storm. Not of rain, but of violence. Atta spent the day preparing. He wasn't just setting snares for rabbits anymore. He was fortifying their home. He showed Charlotte how to use the bow, her movements still awkward, but her aim surprisingly true. "You shoot to injure, not to kill," he instructed, his voice grim. "A wounded man is more trouble than a dead one. He screams. He creates fear." The cold logic of it chilled her to the bone, but she understood. This was not a battle of honor. This was a battle for survival. They came just after midday, not with a rush, but with a cautious, creeping advance. They fanned out, their rifles glinting in the dappled sunlight. Atta had chosen their ground well. The cabin was nestled against a sheer rock face, impossible to approach from behind. The only way in was through a narrow clearing, dotted with boulders and thick trees, a perfect kill zone. From a high ledge, hidden by overgrown bushes, they watched. Atta with his bow, Charlotte with a second, smaller bow he had made for her. The lead prospector, a big bearded man with cruel eyes, stepped into the clearing. "All right, you thieving savage," he bellowed. "We know you're in there. Throw out the gold and the woman, and we might let you live." Ada was silent. An arrow flew from the shadows, striking the tree just beside the man's head with a solid thwack. The man jumped back, cursing. "Fire!" he roared. Gunshots erupted, echoing through the peaceful valley like thunder. Bullets chewed into the logs of the cabin, splintering the wood. But Atta and Charlotte were not in the cabin. From their hidden perch, Atta let another arrow fly. It took one of the men in the thigh. He went down with a high-pitched scream, clutching his leg. The other men scattered, seeking cover. They had expected an easy fight, a cornered animal. They had not expected skilled, invisible resistance. Charlotte's heart was a frantic bird in her chest, but her hands were steady. She saw a man trying to circle around a large boulder. She drew the bowstring back, remembered Atta's words, and let the arrow fly. It struck the man in the shoulder. He yelled in pain and surprise, dropping his rifle. 2 down. The fight devolved into a tense standoff. The prospectors were pinned down, afraid to move. They fired blindly into the trees, their shots wild and ineffective. Atta moved like a ghost along the ledge, firing an arrow from a new position every time, keeping them guessing, keeping them terrified. But they were getting desperate. The leader saw a flicker of movement from their hiding spot. "There!" he screamed, raising his rifle. He fired. Charlotte heard the whistle of the bullet, felt a searing, white-hot pain in her side. She cried out, stumbling back, the world dissolving into a gray haze. Atta was at her side in an instant. "Charlotte!" Her vision swam. She could see the panic in his eyes, a terror that was far more frightening than the prospector's bullets. He had been so careful to protect her, but the world had found her anyway. He tore a strip of cloth from his shirt, pressing it against the wound, his hands stained with her blood. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice weak. "No," he said, his voice choked with a desperate fury. "You do not leave me." Down below, the prospectors, emboldened by her cry, began to advance again. They were trapped. She was bleeding. Death was closing in. But as Atta held her, his face a mask of grief and rage, he saw something over her shoulder, something that made his blood run cold. It wasn't the prospectors. It was another man, stepping silently from the trees behind them. A man wearing the dusty, tattered clothes of a traveler. A man she recognized. Douglas, the guide from her caravan. And he was holding a pistol, aimed not at the prospectors, but directly at Atta's head. Douglas stood there, his face a grim mask, the pistol unwavering. "I thought I'd find you here," he said, his voice flat. Atta gently lowered Charlotte, shielding her body with his own. "Who are you?" he demanded. "I'm the man you should have left for dead," Douglas said, his eyes cold. "The man whose gold you have." It all clicked into place with sickening clarity. The boot print, the lost pouch of gold. Douglas wasn't just a guide. He was a thief. He had been robbing the caravan from the inside. The wolf attack had been his cover, a diversion he'd created, maybe even leading the wolves to the caravan, hoping to pick through the wreckage and disappear. "You," Charlotte whispered, the pain in her side flaring. "You did this." Douglas gave a bitter laugh. "The judge had it coming, him and his fancy friends. I was just taking my share, then you had to go and survive." Down below, the prospectors heard the voices and renewed their advance. They were caught between 2 fires. "Give me the gold, Indian," Douglas snarled, "and I'll kill you quickly." But Atta wasn't looking at Douglas. He was looking past him, at the trees, and for the first time, a slow, grim smile touched his lips. "You brought friends," Atta said, "but so did I." From the shadows of the forest, silent as the falling leaves, figures emerged. 5, then 10, then 20 men. They were not dressed like prospectors. They wore buckskin and carried bows and war clubs. Their faces were painted for battle. Atta's people. Douglas's face went white with terror. He had stumbled into a hornet's nest. The prospectors in the clearing saw the warriors emerge from the trees, surrounding them, and they threw down their guns, their bluster evaporating into pure fear. Atta's warriors descended on them, swift and silent. The fight was over before it truly began. Atta turned his attention back to Douglas, who was trembling, his pistol shaking in his hand. "You have no honor," Atta said, his voice low and dangerous. A warrior stepped up behind Douglas, disarming him with a single sharp blow. They dragged him away, his terrified pleas echoing through the trees. An older warrior, his face a roadmap of scars and wisdom, approached Atta. He looked at Charlotte, bleeding on the ground, then back at Atta. He spoke in their native tongue, his voice stern. "You bring their world into ours. This is the price." "She is one of us now," Atta replied in the same language, his voice unwavering. He knelt beside Charlotte, lifting her gently into his arms. "Take me home," she whispered, her vision fading. "I am," he said, pressing his forehead to hers. "I am." He carried her back to the cabin, the sounds of the forest reclaiming its peace behind them. His people had come. He was not an outcast anymore. He had saved her, and in doing so, he had found his way back to his own world. But as he cleaned her wound, his touch, gentle and sure, a terrible question hung in the air. Could their two worlds ever truly become one? Or would they always be at war, with her caught in the crossfire? The wound was deep, but the bullet had passed clean through. Atta tended to it with a skill born of a lifetime of mending wounds, both his own and others. His people brought herbs and poultices, their silent presence filling the small cabin. Charlotte drifted in a sea of pain and fever, but through it all she felt his hand on hers, a steady anchor in the storm. The old warrior, whose name was Chaitin, became a frequent visitor. He would sit by the fire watching them, his eyes filled with a wisdom that seemed as old as the mountains. One evening, as Charlotte was beginning to heal, Chaitin spoke to her in broken English. "He was lost," he said, nodding toward Atta, who was outside speaking with his men. "His anger was a stone in his heart. You," he looked at her, his gaze piercing, "you have taken the stone away." Charlotte realized the truth. Atta hadn't just been living in isolation. He had been in exile, banished by his own grief and rage. By saving her, by choosing to fight for her, he had been forced to ask for help, to reconnect with the people he had left behind. She had been his bridge back. When Atta returned, she was sitting up, the hawk pendant he had made for her resting against her chest. "Your people," she began. "They are our people now," he corrected her gently. A few days later, Chaitin came to them with grave news. Douglas, under interrogation, had confessed everything. The attack, the theft, the lies. But he had also revealed something else. Charlotte's father, the judge, was not dead. Douglas had only assumed everyone in the caravan had perished. The judge had survived, badly injured, and had made his way to a nearby army fort. He was alive, and he had put a bounty on the head of the savage Indian who had kidnapped his daughter. The world they had fought so hard to protect themselves from was coming for them. The army would not be as easily defeated as a few greedy prospectors. "You must go to him," Atta said, his face grim. "He will not listen to me. If I go, they will never let me return," she said, panic rising in her throat. "And what will they do to you?" "They must find me first," he said. But they both knew the army's reach was long. It was an impossible choice. To stay meant putting him and his entire people in danger. To leave meant losing him forever and leaving him to face the wrath of a world that would never see him as anything but a monster. That night, she held him close, her tears soaking his shirt. "I cannot lose you," she whispered. "You will not," he said, his voice a fierce promise. Our souls know the way back to each other. In the pre-dawn light, Chaitin and two other warriors escorted her to the edge of the woods, a day's ride from the fort. Atta stood beside her. He didn't kiss her. He simply took her hand and placed a small, smooth stone in her palm. "When your heart is afraid," he said, "hold this. Remember the mountain. Remember me." She mounted the horse they had provided. She didn't look back. She couldn't. Every step the horse took was a tear in the fabric of the life they had built. She rode toward the fort, toward the father who thought she was a victim, toward a civilization that would condemn the man who had saved her soul. She was no longer just fighting for her life. She was fighting for his. The fort was a scar on the landscape, a place of sharp angles and straight lines, a world away from the wild beauty of the mountain. When she rode in, a ghost returned from the dead. She was met with chaos, relief, and suspicion. Her father, Judge Alcott, was alive, but he was a shadow of the man she remembered, his body frail, his mind clouded by grief and a thirst for vengeance. "Charlotte," he wept, clutching her hand. "That beast. What did he do to you?" "He saved my life, Father," she said, her voice steady. But her words fell on deaf ears. The story had already been written. A helpless white woman, captured and brutalized by a savage. The commander of the fort, a stern, unyielding man named Colonel Vance, listened to her account with a dismissive air. "Miss Alcott, you're clearly suffering from a traumatic ordeal. Your mind is playing tricks on you." He informed her that a patrol had already been dispatched to hunt Atta down. The bounty was still active. Time was running out. That night, she couldn't sleep. She sat in the small, suffocating room they had given her, clutching the smooth stone Atta had placed in her hand. She had to make them believe her. She had to save him. The next day, she demanded another audience with Colonel Vance. This time, she wasn't pleading. She was the judge's daughter, and she had inherited his fire. "You are hunting an innocent man, Colonel," she said, her voice ringing with authority. "The man you should be looking for is named Douglas. He was our guide. He orchestrated the attack." "Douglas is dead," Vance said flatly, "like everyone else in your caravan." "No," she said, "he is alive, and he is the real villain." She told him about the gold, about the lies, about the confrontation at the cabin. She could see a flicker of doubt in his eyes. He was a military man, a man of logic. The story of a lone Indian defeating 6 armed prospectors didn't quite add up. But a story of betrayal and theft? That was a story he understood. "I will consider what you've said," he conceded, "but until this Douglas is found, my orders stand." It wasn't enough. The patrol was still out there. She had to do more. An idea, desperate and dangerous, began to form in her mind. She knew the general area where Atta and his people were. She also knew that the army patrol was clumsy, loud, easy to track. If she could get to him first, if she could warn him. That night she stole a horse from the stables. Under the cover of darkness, she slipped out of the fort, a lone woman riding back into the wilderness that had almost claimed her, but had ultimately set her free. She was no longer a victim. She was a warrior, riding to save her king. The forest was a different place at night, a labyrinth of shadows and whispers. But she was not the same woman who had stumbled through it in terror months ago. She moved with purpose, her senses alive, reading the signs of the trail. She could hear the clumsy progress of the army patrol miles ahead of her. They were a scar moving through the land, leaving a trail of broken branches and noise. She was a ghost, following in their wake. She found them at dawn, making camp by a stream. She watched from a ridge, her heart pounding. There were 12 of them, heavily armed. Then she saw him, chained between 2 soldiers, his face bruised, but his posture unbroken, was Atta. They had found him. A wave of cold despair washed over her. She was too late. But then she saw Chaitin, and a dozen other warriors, shadows on the ridge opposite her. They had been tracking the patrol, waiting for their moment. An attack would be a bloodbath for both sides. She had to stop it. She rode down into the camp. The soldiers, shocked to see her, raised their rifles. "Hold your fire!" she yelled, her voice carrying the authority of her father's name. "I am Charlotte Alcott!" The patrol's leader, a young, arrogant lieutenant, approached her. "Miss Alcott, what are you doing here? We have your kidnapper." "You have the wrong man," she said, dismounting. She walked straight to Atta, ignoring the soldiers. She looked into his eyes, trying to convey a message of hope. Then she turned to the lieutenant. "The man you want is at the fort. Douglas. He confessed. The order to hunt this man was a mistake." The lieutenant hesitated. Her presence there, alone and defiant, contradicted everything he'd been told. While he was distracted, Chayton and his warriors began to make their presence known, appearing one by one on the ridge, bows drawn. The soldiers grew nervous, their rifles shifting from Atta to the growing threat surrounding them. It was a standoff. A single shot would ignite a massacre. "Listen to me," Charlotte said, her voice calm and clear in the tense silence. "A mistake has been made. Take this man back to the fort. Let Colonel Vance sort this out. If you open fire, none of us will leave this valley alive." The lieutenant, sweating, looked at the dozen rifles of his men, and then at the 50 silent arrows aimed at their hearts. He made his choice. "We're taking him back," he grunted. The journey back was a tense, silent procession. When they arrived at the fort, Colonel Vance was waiting, his face like thunder. But beside him was another man, a man who had been found hiding among the fort's suppliers, trying to book passage on a riverboat east. Douglas. His face was a mask of terror. The sight of Atta, alive, surrounded by soldiers, shattered his composure. He broke, confessing everything in a torrent of panicked words, implicating not just himself, but the powerful man in California Charlotte was supposed to marry, who had hired Douglas to get Judge Alcott out of the way. The conspiracy was bigger and uglier than she had ever imagined. Justice, when it finally came, was swift. The fiancé in California would have federal marshals waiting for him. Douglas would hang, and Atta was unchained. He walked out of the colonel's office, a free man. Charlotte was waiting for him. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. He walked toward her, and she ran into his arms. The whole fort watched as the judge's daughter embraced the savage she had crossed worlds to save. In that moment, they were not white or Indian, civilized or wild. They were just two people who had found their home in each other. Days later, her father passed away in his sleep. His quest for vengeance was over. His daughter was safe. Charlotte buried him, said her goodbyes to the world he represented, and walked out of the fort for the last time. Atta was waiting for her at the edge of the forest with Chayton and his people. "Are you ready?" he asked. "I have been ready since the moment I opened my eyes by the river," she replied. She was no longer a visitor to his world. She was coming home. Years later, travelers would speak of a legend, of a wild place in the mountains where the old ways still lived. They spoke of a fierce tribe of warriors led by a chief named Atta, the Hawk. And they spoke of his wife, a woman with eyes the color of the sky and a voice like calm water, who was as much a part of the mountain as the pines themselves. They had built a new world together, not on the foundations of the old one, but in the ashes of what they had burned down. A world where a soul was not judged by the color of its skin, but by the strength of its love. And in that hidden valley, their love was law. If you enjoyed this story, and you believe that home isn't a place you're from, but a person you'd fight for, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. And let me know in the comments below, what would you cross worlds for?